We didn't welcome Yoko in the studio. John's in love with this girl. If he wants to bring her in the studio, we've got to cope with that.
At 82, Paul McCartney is breaking his silence in a way that turns the spotlight back on all of us. What if the story we've been told wasn't just wrong, but designed to distract us from something much harder to admit? In this video, we're peeling back the polished nostalgia to expose a narrative built on half-truths and emotional deflection. McCartney's words aren't just unexpected, they're disarming, and buried in them is a subtle but powerful confession that rewrites a piece of music history we thought we understood. The question isn't why the Beatles broke up, it's why we were so desperate to believe a certain version of it. The reluctant leader. In the public imagination, Paul McCartney is often seen as the cheerful Beatle, the melodic genius with the catchy hooks and polished persona. But behind the charm and chart-topping success lies a far more complicated figure, one who carried the weight of the band's survival on his shoulders long before it publicly fell apart. As tensions mounted and leadership fractured, it was McCartney who tried, often unsuccessfully, to hold things together. Not out of ego, but out of desperation to preserve something sacred. That desire to lead, while often resented by the others, would come to define both his legacy and his emotional scars. Unlike Lennon, who leaned into rebellion and provocation, or Harrison, who sought spiritual liberation, McCartney became the de facto taskmaster, managing logistics, studio sessions, and even business meetings. It was a role he never asked for, but one he assumed because no one else would. And yet, for all his efforts, Paul became an easy target for criticism. His perfectionism was labeled as controlling. His optimism was dismissed as naivete. But it's that same drive, the relentless work ethic and refusal to let things fall apart, that propelled him beyond the Beatles and into an extraordinary solo career. McCartney's post-Beatles career wasn't a victory tour. It was an uphill fight to regain his voice. Critics then held him up as a lightweight against Lennon's rough-around-the-edges snarl. But over the years, Paul's work has quietly demolished that myth. Starting with the emotional frailty of McCartney, moving through the arena rock roar of Wings and the multi-tracked nuance in latter-day albums, he's been a master at redefining himself, not with big drama, but with continuity, adaptation, and refusal to be bound by what had been. He didn't merely weather the Beatles' split. He survived the shadow that followed. McCartney no longer strives to outrun comparisons or set the record straight. He addresses issues with steady authority, not like a man defending his legacy, but like one finally ready to look back upon it. His recent interviews bear the voice of a man who has nothing left to prove, only things to say. Whether addressing old wounds or resisting contemporary threats to artistry, McCartney's voice has only become more pertinent over the years. And that might be the biggest surprise of all. The Beatle, once regarded as the safe one, is now the most daring truth-teller of them all. But while Paul fought to hold the center, the rest of the band was already drifting towards something he couldn't control: creative freedom. Musical drift. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer just a band. They were four evolving artists pulling in different creative directions. Paul McCartney leaned into melody and structure, often pushing for polished pop arrangements that reflected his affinity for musical discipline. In contrast, John Lennon was moving toward rawer, more experimental sounds influenced by avant-garde art and his partnership with Yoko Ono. This creative divergence, while artistically rich, created growing friction during recording sessions as their once unified vision fractured into competing instincts. George Harrison, long the quiet Beatle, was also coming into his own as a songwriter and musician. With songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, he began producing work that rivaled Lennon and McCartney in depth and originality. But despite his growth, he often found his contributions minimized or dismissed. The Lennon-McCartney dominance in the studio left Harrison increasingly frustrated, feeling like a guest in a band where he was a founding member. His dissatisfaction simmered just beneath the surface, occasionally flaring into open tension. The collaborative magic that had always characterized the Beatles' production process started to dwindle. Where they used to work on gut synergy, sessions now became protracted with fountains of acrimony about arrangements, production, and ownership. Every member came with fully worked out ideas and insisted that the others others follow, leaving little space for spontaneous interplay that powered their early successes. With individual artistry becoming more prominent, the perception of being a cohesive band slowly unraveled. This transformation wasn't the result of hostility so much as necessary individual development. The Beatles began as a close-knit circle of young friends with a common goal. But superstardom, adulthood, and contact with disparate influences pulled them on divergent paths. What had originally made them invincible, four unique voices coming together in cooperation, became the very factor that rendered sustained cooperation impossible. Their drift into music didn't mark only the close of an age. It indicated a profounder reality, namely that legends transcend their origins. Lennon's quiet departure. One of the most overlooked but pivotal moments in the Beatles' breakup story is John Lennon's private decision to leave the band. In September 1969, Lennon quietly told his bandmates he was done. There was no dramatic blow-up or press conference, just a private, firm declaration behind closed doors. This moment marked the true beginning of the end, but it was deliberately concealed from the public, making it a hidden turning point in the band's history. For fans, the Beatles didn't break up until 1970, when Paul McCartney announced his own departure. But in reality, John had already made that move months earlier. The secrecy surrounding the departure of Lennon wasn't merely discretion. It was a calculated move based on legal and contractual exigencies. The Beatles were embroiled in business talks, most notably concerning their new manager, Alan Klein, and the corporate restructuring of Apple Corps. Officially confirming Lennon's departure risked jeopardizing sensitive deals or invoking financial repercussions. Consequently, the group made a collective decision to remain silent, presenting an illusion of solidarity that no longer existed. This silence lent surrealism to their last moments together as a band, where private dissolution was hidden behind public appearances. For Paul McCartney, the weight of such secrecy was heavy. He was not only dealing with the death of a bandmate, but the disintegration of a brotherhood that had encapsulated his adult life. Keeping this truth hidden and still recording and negotiating made an already tense dynamic even more tenuous. Paul would look back on how alone it felt, carrying on with the Beatles, while realizing the center of it had already shattered. The silence was not merely public, it permeated their personal interaction, transforming what was once a creative haven into a cold, transactional one. In retrospect, Lennon's stealthy exit reshapes much of the last chapter of the Beatles' history. It shows that the breakup was not an abrupt break, but a gradual and intentional unwinding, cleverly camouflaged for commercial survival. It also highlights the emotional nuance of the circumstances, where loyalty, fear, and pragmatism conflicted backstage. By the time everyone in the world realized the Beatles were finished, the most important choice had already been made, and Paul had been bearing the responsibility of it all by himself. Paul's post-Beatles collapse. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, the world saw it as the end of an era. For Paul McCartney, it felt like the end of himself. Stripped of the band that had defined his identity for over a decade, he spiraled into a period of intense depression and self-doubt. He turned to alcohol as a way to numb the emotional chaos, unsure of what life looked like without Lennon, Harrison, and Starr at his side. The man who once stood at the center of the world's most influential band suddenly found himself directionless and broken. Taking refuge, Paul withdrew to a secluded farm in Kintyre, Scotland, away from the press, the industry, and even music itself. His life was subdued and monotonous, punctuated by farm labor and a conscious avoidance of creativity. He didn't play instruments. He didn't compose. The mere process of creating music seemed empty without the framework of the Beatles. For a man who had once flourished in constant cooperation, silence was cacophony. It was an era of not only bereavement, but loss of identity. In the midst of this emotional shutdown, only one person stuck by Paul, his wife, Linda McCartney. Even as the rest of the world continued to see her as the photographer who married a Beatle inside the house, she was Paul's lifeline. She believed in him unfailingly. She urged him quietly but continually to get back to music, not for recognition, but to heal. Her presence stabilized him, and her love reawakened something buried beneath fear and resentment. They started a band together, Wings, not to replace the Beatles, but as a creative renewal based on collaboration and potential. This new era wasn't glamorous initially. It was raw, untested, and fraught with public doubt. But for Paul, it was redemption. Coming out of the shadow of the Beatles wasn't simple, but with Linda by his side, he discovered a new voice and a renewed sense of purpose. His path from breakdown to rebirth is not only a tale of survival, it's a testament to vulnerability, resilience, and the strength of love to rebuild what fame and legacy once devoured. Paul's emotional journey with Yoko. During the Beatles' later years, Paul McCartney struggled deeply with Yoko Ono's presence, not just as an individual, but as a disruption to a delicate and unspoken rhythm the band had built over the years. The Beatles' creative process had always existed in an almost sacred, insular space, free from outside influences or emotional interjections. Yoko, by simply being there, seated beside John during studio sessions, speaking during takes, or contributing to artistic decisions, challenged that unspoken code. For Paul, this wasn't merely an intrusion. It felt like a breach of trust, a reminder that the tight brotherhood he cherished was beginning to shift. He didn't always express that discomfort outright, but it simmered quietly, feeding an emotional rift between him and John that neither could fully name at the time. With the hindsight of decades, McCartney has started to untangle those emotions honestly. He's acknowledged that some of his resistance to Yoko wasn't about her as a human being or even as an artist. It was about change and about fear. Fear of losing the Lennon-McCartney team that had defined his persona. Fear of obsolescence in John's new world, and fear of what this change indicated for the band's future. What had initially seemed a personal slight, he now recognizes as a reflection of his own fears. In his own words, he admits that what drove his reaction was emotional immaturity, an unwillingness to let go of what was in favor of embracing what was becoming. It wasn't so much Yoko being next to John as what the act represented. Paul's own later musings are infused with quiet elegance, disclosing a man less concerned with holding on to ego, but with seeking out understanding. He's talked about how he admires the relationship between John and Yoko, not as lovers, but as creative peers. He has come to understand that their relationship, though unconventional to many during the time, provided John with a feeling of freedom and creativity, which he had shared with Paul when they were younger. Instead of competing with that, he now has a certain respect for it. That transformation, from perceiving her existence as a threat to embracing it as a vital aspect of John's existence, is one of the most emotionally advanced turns in Paul's public transformation. It's not an apology, it's a worldview change. In reconsidering his own history through this new lens, McCartney invites listeners to do the same. His emotional process with Yoko isn't merely about clearing the record. It's a larger observation about how time, introspection, and openness can transform even the most deeply held convictions. It's a reminder that growing up is often about admitting your own faults, particularly when those faults were previously hidden behind pride or ignorance. Paul's transformation does more than restore Yoko's reputation. It humanizes his own, demonstrating that even legends are forced to deal with their histories if they're to ever fully grasp their legacy. But personal growth wasn't the only force reshaping the band. Something far less emotional and far more structural was quietly tearing at the seams. Anatomy of a breakup. The breakup of the Beatles has long been painted with bold, simplistic strokes. Blame Yoko Ono, blame egos, blame Paul for going solo. But the truth, as Paul McCartney now emphasizes, is far more nuanced. The dissolution of the world's most famous band was not the result of one dramatic moment or one divisive figure, but rather a complex, slow-burning process driven by a mix of internal and external forces. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were not only battling creative fatigue, but also the suffocating effects of fame. After years of being the focal point of global adoration, the relentless pressure and public scrutiny had become unbearable. The joy of playing music had been overshadowed by the weight of being cultural symbols, and it began to erode the sense of camaraderie that once held them together. One of the strongest catalysts in the breakdown of the Beatles was the loss of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. Epstein had provided a consistent presence, a person who protected the band from the madness of the business scene and let them concentrate on the music. Without him, the group felt lost in a world of disagreeing business counsel, squabbles over power, and management interference. Paul, looking for stability, advocated hiring accountant Lee Eastman, soon-to-be father-in-law, while John, George, and Ringo supported more aggressive and incendiary Alan Klein. This division over management intensified pre-existing tensions and brought business conflicts into the same room where music was being created. As McCartney has since confessed, the studio, which had previously been their sanctuary, was now a courtroom. Aside from the business concerns, there was a more profound, more individual truth at work. The Beatles were drifting apart, not in anger, but in identity. They had come into the group as boys and were departing as men with distinct artistic visions and individual philosophies. John was delving into raw, emotionally charged music and experimental art with Yoko. George was awakening spiritually and flowering as a songwriter. Ringo was working on his solo aspirations quietly. Paul, always the perfectionist, still lived for structure and aspiration, attempting to maintain the machinery, even while its components sailed away in separate directions. Their cohesion, once a strength, had turned into a limitation. What had been family was beginning to feel like duty, and nothing could keep it going through nostalgia. In recent interviews, McCartney is frank and elegant about this chapter in their lives. He does not assign blame or indulge in regret. Rather, he describes the breakup as the inevitable, natural conclusion to an unprecedented streak. There was no villain, he has explained, recognizing the fact that the Beatles broke up not because someone sabotaged them, but because they outgrew what they had created. In so many ways, the Beatles ended not in dissension, but in metamorphosis. They had reached the high point of what they could be as a band, and the only thing remaining was to release. Rather than a senseless implosion, their dissolution, as McCartney now describes it, was an obligatory unwinding, a final chapter to a tale too grand to endure eternally. Copyright in crisis. At 82, Paul McCartney is proving that his voice carries just as much power in politics as it does in music. In a recent BBC interview with Laura Quentsberg, the music legend issued a forceful warning about the UK government's proposed changes to copyright law in the age of artificial intelligence. The legislation under review would allow AI developers to freely use creative content, including songs, lyrics, and other artistic works, unless individual rights holders take steps to opt out. For McCartney, the implications are dire. A future where artists can no longer earn a living, and where creativity is siphoned into profit engines that serve tech companies rather than the people who actually create. You get young guys, girls coming up, and they write a beautiful song, and they don't own it, he said. Anyone who wants can just rip it off. McCartney is not anti-tech. Hardly. He has just used AI himself to revive John Lennon's voice from a vintage demo tape to finish what's now dubbed the Beatles' last song, Now and Then, which then went on to receive Grammy and Brit nominations. But he's clear-cut in his distinction between using AI to enhance or restore original work and using it to harvest creative work without permission. The proposals on hand feature so-called rights reservation, under which artists can opt out. But critics like McCartney claim that the model is unrealistic and exploitative. It is unrealistic to expect artists individually to inform numerous AI platforms and police usage of their work throughout the net, as he characterizes it, a recipe for a wild west of unlicensed content theft. For McCartney, the issue goes beyond regulation within the industry. Beyond this, it comes to the core of what a working artist can and should expect. When we were young in Liverpool, we discovered work that we enjoyed, but that also paid for our bills, he said in an interview with the BBC. You're meant to safeguard us. It's your task. he further added, with a direct reference to government administrators. His concern is not only for established icons such as himself, but for new talent who, without protection, will never have the opportunity to establish a career. If AI can replicate or reuse their work, unpaid and without permission, the incentive to create evaporates. That, he contends, results in a long-term loss of creativity, not just for the music industry, but for culture in general. McCartney's position is part of a wider grassroots rebellion of the UK creative industry, together with hundreds of other artists, including Elton John, Dua Lipa, and members of major music associations. He is calling on lawmakers to reconsider the opt-out approach and adopt an opt-in one prioritizing consent. Critics claim the government's proposals would serve AI creators over an industry that is worth more than £120 billion to the economy. Whilst the government maintains its intention to provide clarity, control, and transparency, McCartney and others remain skeptical. They're not against innovation. They're calling for fairness. And by doing so, Paul McCartney finds himself once again not only influencing music, but also protecting its future. A loud protest in silence. In one of the most unconventional protest efforts in music history, Paul McCartney joined forces with more than 1,000 UK artists to release a silent album titled "Is This What We Want?", a powerful response to proposed changes in UK copyright law related to artificial intelligence. On the surface, the album contains no audible music. Instead, it features a series of silent tracks, whose titles, when read in sequence, spell out a bold message. The British government must not legalize music theft to benefit AI companies. This silent act of defiance turns the absence of sound into a deafening critique of legislation that artists argue threatens the very foundation of creative ownership in the digital era. The brilliance of the album lies in its minimalist subversion. Through making an album that contains no content, but is making a big, full-voiced message through its structure, McCartney and his fellow conspirators show the world how the form can be a resistance in itself. Each performer who contributed gave symbolically, donated an empty track, an act that emphasizes what's being risked, the right to determine how one's work is being used. This minimalist demonstration makes a compelling argument. If AI companies are able to data mine artists' work without permission, silence is the only safe means of expression. The project invites listeners not to hear, but to think, to realize that legislation allowing unrestricted data mining isn't a piece of technical legalese, but a cultural rupture. The record also channels its symbolic power into an actual world impact. Profits from "Is This What We Want?" go directly to Help Musicians, a UK charity that helps music industry workers in crisis. In doing so, the project brings the circle back around between art protest and material aid, providing both voice, bitterly, in silence, and lifeline to working musicians affected by the growing insecurity of the creative economy. For McCartney, the connection is essential. If artists are not protected in policy, they then have to be empowered, at least in practice. Charity brings a complementary sense of mission, grounding the seemingly abstract specter of AI exploitation on tangible human need. What is so powerful about this album is its refusal to abide by the conventions of protest or dissemination. There is no screaming, no rally, no aggressive marketing drive. Rather, McCartney and his peers chose silence, a medium so out of the ordinary in today's barrage of digital information that it is attention-grabbing. It places before the listener, policymaker, and tech world a question that's as political as it is philosophical. If work by artists can be used without their permission or consent, where does the future of creativity lie? Is this what we want? Doesn't just ask that question. It answers with silence and, in doing so, says everything. Rallying artists against exploitation. In a landmark show of unity, Paul McCartney joined hundreds of major figures across the UK's creative industries, including Dua Lipa, Elton John, Ian McKellen, and the Royal Shakespeare Company, to co-sign a powerful open letter urging Prime Minister Keir Starmer to reconsider proposed changes to copyright laws related to artificial intelligence. The letter, organized by Baroness Biban Kidron, a crossbench peer and vocal campaigner for creative rights, warns that the government's current plan would allow AI companies to use copyrighted material without permission, threatening the very fabric of the UK's creative economy. Far from being a niche issue, this initiative spans the worlds of music, film, literature, visual art, theater, and journalism. With over 400 signatories including Nobel laureates, pop icons, and prestigious institutions like the National Theatre and the News Media Association. The heart of the dispute is the government's promotion of an opt-out approach, presuming that creators will be willing to have their work excavated by AI unless they opt out explicitly, a system critics maintain is unrealistic and onerous. The letter condemns the move as a boon to influential technology firms at the cost of working artists, asserting that the UK's reputation as a creative powerhouse hangs in the balance. Rather, it endorses Kidron's draft amendment to the Data Bill, which would compel AI developers to reveal what copyrighted material is incorporated into their models and to obtain permission first. Our work is not yours to give away, the letter uncompromisingly asserts, not only framing this as a matter of law, but also ethics and culture. McCartney's involvement holds special significance, considering both his artistic heritage and his even-handed approach to AI. While he has accepted AI in a managed creative environment, like restoring John Lennon's vocals on Now and Then, he makes a distinct line between collaboration and exploitation. His message, supported by signatories such as Kazuo Ishiguro and Annie Lennox, is that technological progress should not be at the expense of diminishing human creativity. It's not about safeguarding work that already exists, it's about maintaining a viable road ahead for the next generation of songwriters, writers, filmmakers, and performers, those who may never get their foot in the door if their work is not protected and profitable to begin with. This moment of unified pushback could be a turning point in the way the creative industries react to the emergence of generative AI. Instead of fragmenting into separate initiatives, artists and institutions are coming together more and more, understanding that a collective voice is much stronger in the policy sphere. As the House of Lords considers voting on Kidron's amendment, the message from McCartney and his fellow artists is clear. Innovation has to be founded upon fairness. Without secure legal safeguards, the potential for a rich and dynamic creative economy may be substituted by a regime in which original work is harvested as raw material for unchecked algorithms. In such an environment, artists are no longer merely producers. They are champions of the future of culture itself. And just when you think his fight ends with the arts, McCartney takes his voice somewhere unexpected, straight into your morning coffee. Fighting for ethical consumerism. Paul McCartney's influence has long extended beyond music, and in 2025, it struck a chord in the corporate world. In a move that captured international headlines, McCartney joined forces with PETA to successfully pressure Peet's Coffee into eliminating its controversial surcharge on plant-based milks. The $1 fee, previously added to non-dairy alternatives like oat, almond, and pea protein milk, was a point of contention for ethical consumers. In a public letter addressed to Peet's CEO, McCartney urged the company to reconsider the policy, calling attention to the contradiction between its claimed sustainability goals and the environmental impact of dairy production. "I must say this surprised me," McCartney wrote, citing the company's commitment to reducing methane emissions and water waste, yet cow's milk significantly contributes to them. Peet's Coffee moved fast. A matter of days after McCartney's missive, the company revealed it would eliminate the plant-based milk upcharge starting June 4th. In announcing the change, Peet's hailed the shift as one in its efforts towards sustainability and taking another step in the direction of inclusivity towards ethical consumers. consumers. McCartney then welcomed the move, citing it as a victory for animals, the planet, and gentle consumers. It also vindicated the wider campaign strategy of PETA, which had been contemplating stepping up its protests using billboards and demonstrations in the Bay Area. Thanks largely to McCartney's activism, those efforts became moot, being replaced with jubilation and new momentum. This successful campaign is just the latest chapter in McCartney's decades-long commitment to animal welfare and environmentalism. A vegetarian since 1975, McCartney has consistently used his platform to champion sustainable living. In 2009, he launched the Meat-Free Monday campaign with his daughters Mary and Stella, encouraging people to reduce meat consumption to mitigate climate change. In 2017, he voiced the short film One Day a Week, which plotted out the daunting environmental toll of animal agriculture. McCartney's activism is not performative. It's based on conviction and action, marrying public pressure and careful messaging in order to make meaningful change. The Pete's win highlights how his voice, even after half a century or more in the limelight, is still a force to be reckoned with for progressive causes. What makes McCartney's involvement in the Pete's campaign particularly noteworthy is the way it illustrates the increasing overlap between ethical consumerism and corporate responsibility. In an era where businesses publicly declare themselves committed to sustainability, McCartney's rebuke was a reminder that those values need to be more than advertising jargon. By using his credibility and principles, he not only shaped a business choice, but also established a new benchmark for the way companies treat their eco-friendly consumers. By Pete's entering the fold with other big chains such as Starbucks and Dutch Brewers in eliminating plant-based milk fees, McCartney has again redefined the discourse, this time not in terms of melody, but in terms of activism tempered by empathy and effect. Thanks for watching. If this gave you a new perspective on the Beatles' story, hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your take. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories and music history deep dives. And if you're ready to keep going, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.